Welcome to the Jiang Report. What you are about to hear is not a drill, not a simulation, and not a worst-case planning scenario buried in some classified Pentagon basement. What is unfolding right now in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz is the single most catastrophic naval engagement in American military history since Pearl Harbor. And the silence coming out of Washington in the past 6 hours tells you everything you need to know about how badly this has gone. 50 Ghadir-class submarines, invisible, silent, and perfectly positioned, activated simultaneously across the narrowest choke point on Earth. 3,000 naval mines laid with mathematical precision across every navigable lane transformed the world's most critical waterway into a graveyard of steel and fire. And at the center of that graveyard, the USS Ronald Reagan, America's crown jewel of naval projection, along with 10 additional destroyers and support vessels, now sits shattered beneath the surface of the Persian Gulf. This is not a skirmish. This is not a limited exchange of firepower. This is the night the United States Navy was handed its most devastating defeat in the modern era, and the world is watching Washington scramble for an answer it does not have. Tonight on the Jiang Report, we are going to break this down completely layer by layer with no spin and no comfort. Here are the questions we will answer before this broadcast ends. How did Iran manage to deploy 50 submarines and 3,000 mines without a single American surveillance system detecting the operation in time? What does the Ghadir-class submarine actually represent in terms of technological capability? And why did the most advanced naval force in human history fail to neutralize it? What happens to global energy markets, the petrodollar, and the broader American-led security architecture when the world watches 11 U.S. vessels go dark in a single engagement? And perhaps most critically, where does this leave Trump? Where does this leave Israel? And where does this leave the 70 years of American naval supremacy that the entire Western order has been built upon? Stay with us through every segment. The final section will reframe everything you thought you understood about the balance of power in the 21st century. Before we go further, if you are watching this and you care about getting analysis that cuts through the propaganda from every side, please hit subscribe right now. Leave a comment below with your assessment of what Washington should do next, and share this video with anyone who needs to understand what is actually happening. This conversation matters, and your engagement makes it possible. Iran's Ghadir fleet activates Hormuz becomes a killing field. To understand the full magnitude of what happened in the Strait of Hormuz, you need to first strip away every assumption you have ever held about submarine warfare and naval detection technology. The prevailing wisdom inside the Pentagon, inside NATO planning circles, and inside the strategic studies departments of every major Western university was that the United States Navy's sensor architecture was so advanced, so deeply layered, and so thoroughly integrated with satellite surveillance, underwater acoustic arrays, and airborne maritime patrol assets that no adversary could move a significant submarine force without being detected, tracked, and neutralized well before it could pose a genuine threat. That assumption died last night along with 11 American vessels. Iran's Ghadir-class submarine is a platform that has been persistently underestimated by Western analysts for over a decade. At approximately 29 meters in length and displacing roughly 120 tons submerged, the Ghadir is classified by most Western assessments as a midget submarine, a designation that carries with it an implicit dismissal of serious combat potential. That dismissal has now cost the United States Navy dearly. The Ghadir was not designed to engage in open ocean fleet battles against American carrier strike groups. It was designed with extraordinary specificity to operate in exactly the environment where last night's engagement took place. The shallow thermocline disrupted, acoustically complex coastal and littoral waters of the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. In those waters, the Ghadir's small acoustic signature, its ability to operate at minimal speed while resting on the bottom to mask its presence entirely, and its capacity to carry both torpedoes and mines, makes it not a second-tier platform, but a precision instrument of asymmetric devastation. Iran did not deploy 50 Ghadir submarines overnight. This operation represents the culmination of a deployment strategy that intelligence analysts now believe began weeks before the first vessel was detected anywhere near Hormuz. The submarines were moved in small clusters using the natural acoustic masking provided by commercial shipping traffic, by the thermal layering of Persian Gulf water columns, and by deliberate timing patterns designed to fall between the surveillance windows of American reconnaissance satellites. Each cluster moved independently, maintaining strict emission control running on battery power to eliminate any thermal or electromagnetic signature, and positioning itself with precise coordination across a predetermined grid that would only become apparent when the operation was fully activated. When the order came, 50 submarines across 11 distinct engagement zones activated simultaneously. There was no warning, no buildup detectable to surface vessels, and no opportunity for the Ronald Reagan's defensive systems to respond in a coordinated fashion. The 3,000 mines represent the second and equally devastating dimension of this operation. Iran's naval mining capability has been documented for years, but has never been deployed at this scale in a real-world engagement. The mines used in last night's operation are not the simple contact mines of the Second World War. Iran's current inventory includes influence mines, bottom mines, and rocket-propelled rising mines, all of which are specifically designed to defeat modern naval countermeasures. Influence mines detonate in response to the magnetic, acoustic, or pressure signature of a passing vessel, making them extraordinarily difficult to neutralize without knowing the precise triggering parameters programmed into each individual device. Bottom mines sit on the seabed at depths where conventional minesweeping operations struggle to achieve consistent clearance. Rising mines launch a self-propelled warhead upward when triggered, giving them an engagement envelope that extends well beyond their physical position on the seafloor. The 3,000 mines laid across Hormuz were not placed randomly. They were positioned according to a hydrographic analysis of every navigable channel, every depth contour, and every tidal pattern in the strait, creating an interlocking field of overlapping engagement envelopes that left no safe passage for a vessel of destroyer size or larger. The USS Ronald Reagan, a Nimitz-class nuclear-powered supercarrier, displacing over 100,000 tons and carrying an air wing of approximately 80 aircraft, struck the first mine at precisely the moment the submarine assault began. The simultaneous activation of both threats was not accidental. It was the operational core of the Iranian strategy designed to saturate the defensive response capacity of every vessel in the strike group at the exact same moment. When a carrier strike group faces a submarine threat, its defensive posture shifts toward anti-submarine warfare assets, pulling helicopters, surface combatants, and electronic systems toward that mission. When it simultaneously faces a minefield, those same assets are needed for mine avoidance and countermeasure operations. Facing both simultaneously, with 50 submarine contacts appearing across the tactical picture at the same instant that mine detonations began registering across multiple hull positions, the defensive coordination of the strike group collapsed within minutes. The result was 11 vessels destroyed or mission killed, 7,200 sailors dead, wounded, or stranded in waters that Iran now effectively controls. And the silence from the Pentagon that has lasted 6 hours and counting, Iran's technological leap, the weapons that broke American naval doctrine. To fully appreciate why last night's engagement unfolded the way it did, we need to go deeper into the specific weapon systems Iran brought to bear, because the story of this engagement is not simply a story about submarines and mines. It is a story about a decade-long investment in exactly the right capabilities, chosen not to match American naval power symmetrically, but to exploit its specific vulnerabilities with maximum efficiency. The Ghadir-class submarine carries a standard armament of 2 torpedo tubes capable of firing the VA-111 Shkval-derived rocket torpedo, a weapon that travels at speeds in excess of 200 knots underwater by generating a supercavitating bubble of gas around its body, eliminating hydrodynamic drag and making it virtually impossible for a surface vessel to evade once fired at close range within the confined geometry of Hormuz. The engagement distances inside the strait, where water depths range from only 25 to 100 meters across the navigable channels, mean that a Ghadir firing position can be established at ranges where conventional torpedo countermeasures have almost no time to function. The supercavitating torpedo, fired from 50 separate submarine positions across 11 engagement zones, created an inescapable geometric web of incoming weapons that overwhelmed the point defense capabilities of every escort vessel in the strike group simultaneously. Complementing the submarine and mine assault, Iran deployed its shore-based anti-ship missile batteries in a role that has been called the hammer behind the anvil by strategic analysts observing the operation. The Noor anti-ship missile, Iran's domestically produced variant of the Chinese C-802, and the more advanced Ghadir missile with its range in excess of 200 kilometers were used not as the primary strike weapon, but as a forcing function, compelling any surviving American surface vessels attempting to maneuver out of the mine and torpedo engagement zone to move into pre-designated firing corridors where the missiles were already targeted. Every exit from the killing zone was covered. The geometry of destruction was three-dimensional, with threats arriving simultaneously from below the surface via torpedoes, from the surface via mine detonations, and from the shore via precision anti-ship missiles, leaving no vector of escape that was not also a vector of engagement. Iran also deployed its fleet of Fateh-class and Sinai-class fast attack craft in a swarming role designed specifically to exploit the gaps in the strike group's defensive posture created by the submarine and mine threats. At speeds of over 45 knots, these vessels approach from multiple directions simultaneously, carrying C-704 anti-ship missiles and rocket pods, adding yet another layer of incoming threats to an already saturated defensive picture. The fast attack craft were not expected to survive the engagement in significant numbers. They were deployed as a consumption weapon, forcing the surviving American warships to expend their close-in defensive ammunition against small, fast-moving targets, while the submarine and mine threats continued their work against the larger vessels. The tactical logic was identical to that used to exhaust the Iron Dome over Israel. Use cheap, expendable platforms to drain the defensive capacity of expensive, sophisticated systems, then deliver the decisive blow when the defenses are empty. Perhaps the most significant technological element of the entire operation was Iran's electronic warfare and command coordination capability, which demonstrated a level of sophistication that caught American planners entirely off guard. The simultaneous activation of 50 submarines across 11 engagement zones, perfectly coordinated with the mine detonation sequence and the shore-based missile and fast attack craft launches, required a command and control architecture of extraordinary precision and resilience. Iran clearly possesses a hardened, redundant, and jamming-resistant communications network capable of delivering simultaneous activation signals to distributed assets operating under strict emission control. This is not a capability that was developed last week. It is the product of years of investment in exactly the kind of warfare that Iran identified as its asymmetric advantage. The ability to coordinate a multi-domain, multi-vector surprise attack of overwhelming complexity in the world's most strategically significant choke point. Washington's response, paralysis, denial, and the limits of superpower power. In the hours following the initial engagement, the response from Washington has been a study in institutional paralysis that rivals any moment in recent American strategic history. The first public acknowledgement from the Pentagon came 4 hours and 17 minutes after the initial mine detonation, a delay that itself speaks to the scale of the shock experienced at the highest levels of the American military establishment. The statement released was careful, measured, and deeply evasive, acknowledging that American naval assets had sustained casualties in the Strait of Hormuz while providing no specific numbers of vessels lost, no casualty figures, and no assessment of the current operational status of the strike group. The deliberate vagueness of that statement was not accident but policy, because the full picture of what has happened is one that the American government is not yet ready to present to its own public or to its allies. The carrier strike group, centered on the USS Ronald Reagan, was the centerpiece of American naval deterrence in the Persian Gulf theater. Its presence was the most visible and most powerful symbol of Washington's commitment to the security of regional allies and the freedom of navigation through Hormuz. The destruction of that symbol, the images of American sailors being pulled from burning waters, the silence of a flight deck that yesterday operated 80 combat aircraft and today sits partially submerged, represents a blow to American credibility that goes far beyond the immediate tactical reality of the engagement. President Trump, who has staked enormous personal and political capital on a posture of maximum pressure and overwhelming force as the solution to the Iranian problem, now faces a crisis for which his entire strategic framework offers no coherent response. The options available to Washington at this moment are all deeply problematic. A conventional military retaliatory strike against Iranian territory risks triggering further escalation across every dimension of the conflict simultaneously, and does so from a position of tactical disadvantage with the surviving American naval assets in the region, now confined to waters that Iran's mine-laying capability can reach. A nuclear response is not on the table in any realistic planning scenario. A diplomatic approach would require Washington to acknowledge the full scale of its defeat, opening a negotiating process from a position of demonstrated weakness that would shatter every alliance commitment America has made across the entire Middle East and beyond. And the option of doing nothing, of absorbing this blow in silence while presenting it to the American public as something other than what it actually is becoming less viable with every passing hour as satellite imagery, intercepted communications, and reporting from Allied intelligence services begin filling in the picture that the Pentagon statement deliberately obscured. The specific paralysis visible in Washington right now reflects a deeper structural problem that this engagement has exposed at the core of American strategic thinking. The United States military has been built and funded and organized around the concept of full-spectrum dominance, the idea that American technological and financial superiority is so overwhelming that no adversary can develop a threat that cannot be countered by deploying more advanced American systems. The Hormuz engagement has shattered that concept in its most critical application. Iran did not defeat American naval power by developing a better carrier or a more advanced destroyer or a more capable fighter aircraft. Iran defeated American naval power by identifying the specific environmental conditions, the specific tactical geometry, and the specific resource constraints within which American technological superiority becomes irrelevant, and then investing precisely and patiently in the capabilities needed to exploit those conditions. That is a lesson that will reverberate through every war college and every strategic planning department in the world for decades to come. The immediate practical consequence for Washington is the question of what comes next in terms of force posture. The USS Carl Vinson and its strike group, currently positioned in the Eastern Mediterranean in support of operations related to the Israeli front, represents the nearest available replacement for the Ronald Reagan in terms of carrier aviation capability. Moving the Vinson into the Persian Gulf, however, would require it to transit through or near the waters that Iran has just demonstrated it can turn into a killing zone at will. The strategic dilemma is perfect in its cruelty. America needs to demonstrate continued naval presence in the Gulf to prevent total collapse of regional confidence in its security guarantees. But moving additional assets into the area risks repeating the engagement on an even larger scale, against a force that is still intact, still positioned, and still operating from a position of tactical advantage in waters it knows better than any adversary on Earth. The weight of will, Iran's strategic endurance against borrowed power. There is a dimension of this conflict that Western analysis consistently undervalues, and it is the dimension that ultimately explains why the engagement at Hormuz unfolded the way it did, and why its consequences will extend far beyond the tactical outcome of any single naval battle. That dimension is the question of strategic will, the depth of commitment, the readiness to absorb cost and continue, and the clarity of purpose that sustains a military force through prolonged engagement against a materially superior adversary. Iran has been under comprehensive American economic sanctions for over 4 decades. It has been threatened with military action repeatedly and credibly. It has watched its economy subjected to deliberate strangulation through financial isolation, technology denial, and the weaponization of the global banking system against it. It has endured assassination of its top military and scientific leaders on its own soil. And through all of that, Iran's military development program has not slowed. It has accelerated. The Ghadir submarines that sank 11 American vessels last night were not purchased from a foreign supplier. They were designed, engineered, and built inside Iran by Iranian engineers and Iranian workers, using Iranian industrial capacity that was developed specifically because the country knew it could not rely on external sources for the capabilities it needed. The 3,000 mines that turned Hormuz into a graveyard were manufactured in Iranian factories. The supercavitating torpedoes, the influence mines, the command and control architecture that coordinated the entire operation simultaneously across 11 engagement zones, all of it is the product of a sustained investment in self-reliant military capability that was driven precisely by the pressure Washington applied. This is the strategic paradox that American policymakers have repeatedly failed to internalize. The tools of maximum pressure, sanctions, isolation, technology, denial, and military threat, when applied against a state with sufficient institutional coherence and popular legitimacy to absorb the cost, do not produce capitulation. They produce exactly what Iran has produced, a military capability specifically tailored to defeat the power applying the pressure. Every sanction that prevented Iran from purchasing advanced aircraft produced an investment in anti-aircraft and anti-access systems. Every sanction that degraded Iran's ability to purchase foreign naval vessels produced an investment in domestically built submarines and fast attack craft. Every attempt to isolate Iran from the global financial system produced an investment in alternative payment architectures and economic partnerships with Russia, China, and others willing to operate outside that system. The Hormuz engagement is not an accident of history. It is the predictable and in many ways inevitable product of 40 years of American policy producing exactly the adversary America most feared. Contrast this with the strategic position of the United States in this conflict. America is fighting for interests that are real but abstract to its own population. The freedom of navigation through a waterway most Americans could not locate on a map, the security of an ally whose domestic politics are deeply controversial within American society, the maintenance of a petrodollar system whose benefits accrue primarily to financial institutions rather than to ordinary American workers and families. The soldiers and sailors who serve in American forces are professionals of extraordinary quality and courage. But the political leadership that directs their deployment is constrained by a democratic accountability that makes sustained, costly engagement deeply problematic, especially when the public rationale for that engagement becomes increasingly difficult to maintain in the face of visible, undeniable military defeat. Iran's leadership operates under different constraints. The revolutionary framework that defines Iranian national identity treats this conflict not as a foreign policy choice, but as an existential struggle for national sovereignty and dignity. That framing, whatever one thinks of the Iranian government that promotes it, produces a depth of strategic commitment that outlasts the political cycles, the budget debates, and the public opinion fluctuations that constrain American strategic planning. The asymmetry of will between the two sides in this conflict has been visible for years to anyone willing to look honestly at the evidence. Last night, that asymmetry produced a concrete military outcome that can no longer be talked around or explained away. 11 American vessels destroyed in a single engagement represents a cost that will register in American strategic consciousness in a way that years of diplomatic maneuvering and economic pressure simply cannot match. The global earthquake, petrodollar collapse, multipolar dawn, and the end of naval supremacy. The consequences of what happened in the Strait of Hormuz last night extend far beyond the immediate military outcome of the engagement. They reach into the foundations of the global economic and political order in ways that will reshape the world for decades. To understand why, you need to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually represents in terms of the global system, not just as a waterway, but as the physical embodiment of American enforced order in the world's most energy-critical region. Approximately 20% of all globally traded oil and roughly 35% of all liquefied natural gas traded by sea transits through the Strait of Hormuz. The ability of the United States Navy to guarantee the security of that transit to ensure that the energy supplies on which the entire global industrial economy depends can flow without interruption has been the foundational justification for American military presence in the Persian Gulf for over 5 decades. It is also the physical mechanism through which the petrodollar system operates. Oil is priced in dollars. Countries that need oil must hold dollars to buy it. Countries that hold dollars must invest them in U.S. Treasury instruments or other dollar-denominated assets. That recycling mechanism is what funds American deficit spending, what keeps U.S. interest rates lower than they would otherwise be, and what gives Washington the unique ability to impose its will on the global financial system in ways no other country can replicate. When Iran demonstrated last night that it can close Hormuz, that it can destroy the naval force America sends to keep it open, and that it can do so at a cost in material terms, that is a tiny fraction of what America loses in the engagement. It delivered a message to every energy importing country on earth that the security guarantee underwriting the petrodollar system cannot be maintained against a determined adversary with the right capabilities and the right geography. The immediate market response has been dramatic. Oil prices spiked through the $140 mark within hours of the engagement becoming public knowledge, the highest level in over a decade, and futures markets are pricing in sustained disruption at levels that reflect a fundamental reassessment of supply security rather than a temporary spike. That reassessment, if it persists, feeds directly into the inflation calculations of every major central bank, the energy security planning of every major economy, and the political stability of every government whose population is sensitive to energy prices, which is to say every government on Earth. The geopolitical implications run even deeper than the immediate energy market disruption. Russia, which has been watching the engagement with what can only be described as carefully concealed satisfaction, is the world's other major oil and gas superpower. Every dollar that oil prices rise produces a direct revenue windfall for Moscow that weakens the economic impact of Western sanctions and strengthens Putin's ability to sustain operations in Ukraine and elsewhere. The Hormuz engagement has handed Russia a strategic dividend worth hundreds of billions of dollars in future revenue without Russia firing a single shot or spending a single ruble. China's position is even more strategically consequential. Beijing is the world's largest oil importer, which means it is also the country most immediately exposed to supply disruption through Hormuz. But China has been quietly building exactly the kind of alternative supply relationships and payment architectures that would allow it to navigate a sustained Hormuz closure far more effectively than its Western competitors. Long-term oil supply agreements with Russia pipeline infrastructure that bypasses maritime choke points, entirely currency swap arrangements that allow energy trade in yuan rather than dollars. All of these investments now look not like hedging against a hypothetical risk, but like preparation for the exact scenario that materialized last night. The response of smaller Gulf states to last night's engagement will be one of the most closely watched indicators of how the new strategic reality is being absorbed by regional actors. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait all rely on Hormuz for their oil exports and have historically aligned with American security guarantees as the foundation of their energy export security. But those guarantees have now been exposed as contingent on an American ability to project naval power into Hormuz that has just been decisively challenged. The quiet conversations already underway in Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Doha about what alternative security frameworks might look like, about whether energy export agreements denominated in currencies other than the dollar represent a prudent hedge, and about whether closer relationships with China and Russia offer a more reliable path to long-term stability will accelerate dramatically in the wake of last night's engagement. The NATO alliance, already strained by disputes over burden sharing over the Ukraine commitment and over the fundamental question of whether American leadership of the Western security order still delivers the security it promises now, faces its most serious credibility test in a generation. If the United States cannot protect its own naval assets in Hormuz, the implicit guarantee that underwrites every NATO commitment in Europe and the Pacific must now be re-examined, not in abstract strategic terms, but in the concrete light of what the Iranian military just demonstrated is possible against American forces. That re-examination will not be comfortable for Washington, and its conclusions will not be favorable for the continuation of American-led order as it has functioned for the past 7 decades. The longer-term structural shift that last night's engagement accelerates is the transition from a unipolar international order organized around American military and financial supremacy to a genuinely multipolar world in which multiple regional powers backed by nuclear deterrence, independent military capabilities, and alternative economic architectures can define and defend their own strategic interests against American pressure. That transition has been underway for years, driven by the rise of Chinese economic power, the reconsolidation of Russian military capability, and the gradual erosion of American soft power credibility through a succession of costly and inconclusive military engagements. But transitions of this magnitude typically require a catalytic event, a moment that crystallizes the new reality in a way that makes the old framework impossible to maintain. The Battle of Hormuz, as last night's engagement will inevitably come to be called, may well represent exactly that catalytic moment. The world that emerges from this engagement will be one in which American naval supremacy, the foundation on which the entire post-World War II global order was built, is understood not as an unchallenged absolute, but as a conditional capability that can be defeated by a determined adversary, with the right strategy, the right weapons, and the right geography. That understanding changes every calculation in every capital, about every aspect of how the international system functions. It changes the calculus of countries considering whether American security guarantees are worth the political cost of alignment with Washington. It changes the calculations of countries considering whether to invest in the military capabilities needed to deter American pressure. It changes the calculations of financial institutions and sovereign wealth funds, considering the long-term stability of dollar-denominated assets in a world where the military power that backs those assets has just been visibly and dramatically challenged. The Jiang Report will continue covering every development as it emerges from the smoke and the silence and the careful statements of governments that are still trying to understand what the world looks like now that the USS Ronald Reagan and 10 American destroyers are on the bottom of the Persian Gulf. What you have heard tonight is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of the most consequential chapter in the geopolitics of the 21st century. The old order has just taken its most serious wound. The question now is not whether it will survive that wound unchanged, because it will not. The question is what replaces it, who shapes that replacement, and whether the transition happens through careful diplomacy and negotiation or through a further cascade of military escalation that none of the parties currently involved can fully control. That is the question we will be unpacking in every broadcast that follows. The Strait of Hormuz will not reopen tomorrow. The mines will not be cleared in a week. The American public will not accept the full story of what happened last night without demanding accountability that the current administration is not prepared to provide. And Iran, having demonstrated the capability it spent decades building, is not going to step back from the strategic position it has just achieved. The balance of power has shifted in the waters of the Gulf, in the markets of the world, and in the minds of every leader and every planner and every citizen who is paying attention to what the Battle of Hormuz has just told us about the world we are living in. If this analysis has given you a clearer picture of what is at stake, please share this video immediately with everyone in your network who needs to understand these developments. Leave your assessment in the comments below. Do you believe Washington has any viable path forward from this position? Can American naval supremacy be rebuilt in a world where Iran has demonstrated what is now possible? Subscribe to the Jiang Report for continuous coverage as this story develops. The next broadcast will cover the first diplomatic responses from Moscow and Beijing and what their carefully chosen words tell us about exactly how they plan to move in the strategic opening that last night's engagement has created for them. This is the Jiang Report. Stay informed, stay sharp, and we will see you in the next one.